It's like night and day. These are not the same style of beer. These are not the same style of beer. Let's talk about Old Man's IPA. So yesterday, my friend Rolf at Bergen Beer Blog made a blog post about the Norwegian Old Man's IPA, also known as Gammelmann's IPA. So I think that Gammelmann's IPA has become its own style of IPA. Now, of course, it's too small to be recognized by the homebrewing judging guidelines, and of course, like the big BJCP homebrewing judges guidelines, they're far bigger, and of course they wouldn't consider something as small as Norwegian IPA. But I feel like locally in Norway, it is a distinct style, and it's a style that there are lots of different alternatives for, and they have specific things that are unique to that style that don't fit well in West Coast IPA or New England IPA, or English IPA for that matter. So the Norwegian ones tend to be unfiltered, almost always unfiltered. They tend to be a little bit darker than their American counterparts. I think that's not just the use of caramel malts, but I think it's also the use of sort of more of English malts that tend to be malted just slightly darker, and tend to be more flavorful than like the very neutral American two-row, which in turn adds this extra malty character to the Norwegian Gammelmann's IPA, and they tend to be a little bit yeastier than the American West Coast IPA. Now, on the other side of this, my definition of what a West Coast IPA is would be that, like, as a rule, they're filtered. They tend to be incredibly neutral in both yeast and malt. They tend to almost always use like 90 to 95% American two-row. Now, we don't get American two-row in Norway. I don't think we've ever had a beer. I can't remember a beer brewed in Norway that said that American two-row was used, but it's an incredibly neutral malt. And if you've tasted a really good West Coast IPA, like Pliny the Elder, for example, they tend to be based on these really, really neutral malts that just give a light caramel note. And caramel being like that last little percentage. Often there'll be like a tiny little bit of very light caramel, and a little bit of carapils, which helps you get an even crispier body and helps with a little bit of extra head retention. New England IPA is something completely different again, but they can actually be brewed pretty similar, believe it or not, West Coast IPA and New England IPA. If you see pictures of the way that a lot of West Coast IPAs look before they're filtered, you'd think it was a New England IPA. And of course, that's going to end up in something which is a sort of a hop explosion. It's a very fruity, like, that is my opinion, and that's what I wrote in that blog post. But it's always good to challenge your opinions. And I wrote in my part of that blog post that it would be very interesting to taste Vestkyst, Gin Vestkyst, and Stone IPA together to compare them and see what the differences are. These were sort of my definitions. This is very much what I would define as a Norwegian Gammelmann's IPA, Old Man's IPA. You know, I think a lot less patronizing name would be just calling it a Norwegian IPA. It's a distinct style, and I think it deserves a distinct name. So Vestkyst would be my style definition of that. Other examples would be Nøgne Ør's Two Captains, and I think sort of Sufjellsfløyen is headed down that route, but it's in a sort of middle area. And I'm going to talk about this more in the future, but styles are like, they're just like music genres. There's no hard line between them. It's all a spectrum, and it's all defined by the person drinking it. But moving on. On the other hand, Stone IPA is, I think, indisputably an example of the West Coast IPA style. Other ones would be Pliny the Elder from Russian River. But enough talk. Let's open them up and see how they taste. Stone IPA. Now, this is a classic thing with a West Coast IPA, right? Like a classic West Coast IPA. It's crystal clear. It looks like a freaking Pilsner. Compare that to this. So look at the color and look at how transparent it is. It's not very. So the one on the right clearly has some darker malts in it. It's clearly not been filtered. And the one on the left clearly has been filtered, and it's mostly pale malt. It's a lot lighter. You can see the head retention on Stone's beer is a lot better, and it's a little bit meh on Chin's Vestgist. You can clearly see there's like visual differences already, and this is a really good definition of the visual difference to me between a Norwegian IPA and a West Coast IPA. Let's have a smell. I should mention actually, the Vestgist has a big advantage here. This Stone IPA, it was canned in March of 2020, 10 months ago. And although West Coast IPAs do tend to have a big advantage with shelf life, 10 months is a long time for an IPA. The Vestgist was bottled in December. It's got a big advantage there. Yeah, see, this is absolute classic. Even though it's 10 months old, it's bursting out of the glass with pine sap, with a little bit of grapefruit rind and a little bit of orange. It's just it's everything I want in a crispy West Coast IPA. Now, I haven't tasted it yet, so crispy is getting a bit ahead of myself, but I have tasted it before and I know what's coming. Completely dry. Mouthfeel is not a word that I would use when describing this beer. There isn't much mouthfeel because it's completely dry. It's got a very assertive bitterness and it's crispy. And that crispiness, it comes from not having the sweetness from those darker malts. It comes from filtering, and it comes from it being completely dry. And that's what makes it so good for me on a summer day, I think. It's absolutely delicious, even though it's 10 months old. It's like, this is the closest you can get to shelf stability with an IPA. Absolutely fantastic. Let's head over to Chin Vestgist. Now, see, it's really weird, okay? Because this beer is a month old. It should, by all accounts, it should be far hoppier than this. It isn't. It's maltier, right? It's yeastier. It's got a lot of yeasty notes. It's got like a lot of dirty yeasty notes. What it doesn't have is a whole lot of hops. And I find that super interesting, and it's what sort of puts me out a little bit about a lot of Norwegian IPAs, is that even though they're IPAs, they don't tend to be overwhelmingly hoppy. A lot of people use the word balance when describing a West Coast IPA, and I think that's utter bullshit because it's one of the most unbalanced styles that you can think of. It's like it's all hops and it's all bitterness and it's almost nothing else. You give this to a person who hasn't been drinking IPAs for 6 years and they'll think, fuck, that's bitter, I hate it, because it's unbalanced, and that's what's good about it. Like, that's a positive thing. It's unbalanced. Stop saying West Coast IPAs are balanced. They're not. This, on the other hand, now I could understand someone calling this balanced. It's got a balance between a light bitterness. It's not the assertive bitterness that you get in Stone IPA. It has a little bit of a floral note from the yeast. It has a little bit of phenols from the yeast. It has some clear malty notes. Like, not at all difficult to pick out bready malty notes, like whole grain bread. And then there's some light American hoppiness, and that's what makes it not an English IPA. An English IPA should be, I mean, it would be even milder than this, but it would be English hop types, and that has a very different profile to what we're getting here. It's not crispy. It's got a fair whack of sweetness, has a lot less bitterness, and because it isn't filtered, it has a completely different mouthfeel. Mouthfeel is a word that I could use to describe this beer. It has a completely different mouthfeel than the Stone does. This is crispy and sharp and focused on that pine, focused on that grapefruit. The flavor is transparent in a way, whereas this, to me, it's a little bit muddled. It's got a little bit of bitterness, and it's just it would work better with food, right? Because it's more of a non-analyzing beer. It's a beer you can sit there and enjoy without thinking about it too much. This will kick your fucking ass. That's a beer that demands attention with that huge hit of bitterness. This doesn't have that. And that's the difference, really. It's like night and day. These are not the same style of beer. These are not the same style of beer. It's like, try this test yourself. These are both in, like, every Vinmonopolet has Vestkist, and Stone IPA, albeit 10 months old, it's in Bestillingsutvalget. It's in the order, it's in the mail order category on Vinmonopolet. So, I mean, try it yourself and see the difference here. These are not the same style of beer. Now, I mean, I think you could probably argue that this is an English IPA. It says in a lot of style guidelines that English IPAs should use English hops, but whatever. It's closer to that than anything else. It's darker, it's unfiltered, it's not that bitter, it's quite restrained in hoppiness. It's very easy drinking in a different way. But yeah, I mean, like, I hadn't tasted either of these beers in quite a long time when I wrote that comment about Vestkist versus Stone IPA. But this is like validation for me, because it couldn't be more different. The distance from this beer to this beer, it's the same distance from this beer to a Treehouse New England IPA. Seriously, like, it couldn't be more dissimilar. And to the people who think that these are the same style of beer, I mean, really, go out and try this yourself. They're not. They're just not. What do you think? What's a Gammelmann's IPA to you? What's an Old Man's IPA to you? What's the difference between a West Coast IPA and Vestkist? Is Vestkist an IPA? Let me know.